the most basic biblical teaching one can grasp is that Jesus, the Messiah, is a human being. In order to be a human being, you must begin in the womb of your mother. That's what constitutes a human being. Now, the beginning and the origin, the genesis, as we have in Matthew 1:18, the origin of the Son of God is clearly by miracle, a biological miracle wrought in Mary. But he begins, nevertheless, in the womb of his mother. He has to. He has to be a descendant of David through Mary. That's quite clear. But he's miraculously begotten, as it says in Matthew 1:18, and miraculously conceived. He's the Son of God, the Son of Mary, the Son of David, and indeed the Son of Eve, all rolled into one. But if you antedate him to be some sort of an angel before he was conceived, you've really ruined his humanity. That's the danger. It's essential for Jesus to be human. You cannot be pre-human and human. If you're pre-human, you are non-human. Your origin is non-human. You're either an angel or you're God the Son. Neither of those will work on the deliberate Christology of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the Synoptic Gospels were written, as Franz Josef Kuschel says so nicely, to try to thwart, to try to stave off this notion of a non-human, pre-human Jesus. They're written with this in view, that you're to believe in the Messiah who began miraculously in the womb of his mother. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is absolutely right in probably coming against this erroneous notion of a pre-human, pre-existing Messiah, when Paul says the first man is Adam, the second man is Jesus, in that order. Not the spiritual man first, but the physical man from the earth first, followed by the man who has now become a life-imparting spirit. That's to say, a personality who is spirit. He's no longer flesh and blood. It doesn't mean he doesn't have a body. Jesus showed up after his resurrection, said, "Touch me, I'm not a ghost." He was an immortalized man. He was an immortalized man from the moment of resurrection, and he remains that now. He's still a man. Note the text in Acts 17, which says that God is going to judge the world by a man, still a man, whom he's appointed for this, and proven it by resurrecting him from the dead. What a marvelous verse. Jesus speaks of the Son of Man at the right hand. You will see the Son of Man. That's the Adoni, not Adonai, but Adoni, the human Lord. There's no verse, and James Dunn says this so nicely in his book about did the early Christians worship Jesus. He says that Psalm 110:1 is like a golden thread running through the New Testament. How true that is. We will awake, I think, from some of the darkness that we receive from the very problematic councils, and councils, even in the articles of the Church of England, councils, we note, can err. They have erred. They've turned Jesus into a most extraordinary bi-person, a sort of a hybrid between human and man, and it doesn't work. It destroys his humanity. If you're saying that he's the Christ and a non-human being, a pre-human being, you're giving with one hand, taking away with the other. You're simply conflicted. It doesn't make any sense to say, I believe he's the Christ, and then contradict that by saying, I believe he isn't the Christ. The Christ, by definition, the Son of God, by definition, begins in the womb of Mary. Luke 1:35 is a critically important verse. It should be discussed all the time, and it isn't. Gabriel there is brought into the scene to clarify a piece of theology which could have saved us from centuries of conflict. Gabriel there, in response to the very good question of Mary, how can this be that I'm going to bear a child, beget a child, conceive a child? How can this be since I don't have a husband? It's a wonderful question, innocent question. And Gabriel says, Holy Spirit, divine power, the creative activity of God, in this case procreative activity, the generating power of God by miracle, nothing to do with sex with Mary, that's absolutely absurd, don't even think of that. But by miracle, Gabriel says, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you, Mary, and for that reason, note the Greek there, theoke, I'm using the modern Greek pronunciation, theoke, for that reason precisely, and no other reason, he will be called and will be the Son of God. That should settle all arguments. If only people would begin with Matthew, Mark, and Luke and not rush to John or Paul, not initially, but go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were written, as Kuschel says so well in his wonderful book, Born Before All Time, the dispute about the origin of Jesus Christ. Those books were supposed to stop what later became a Gnostic heresy, in fact, a pseudo-Gnostic heresy. It has been very well said by John Knox that you can have the humanity of Christ without the pre-existence, or you can have the pre-existence without the human Jesus. You cannot have both. It has been well said by Pannenberg, by John A.T. Robinson, and by many others, and indeed by Harnack, the prince of church historians, of course, and a very astute theologian too, it has been well said that pre-existence literally and virginal begetting obviously exclude each other. They're mutually exclusive ideas. You cannot pre-exist yourself and then come into existence in the womb. You could talk about a transformation of an already existing angel, or God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, who transforms himself, who reduces himself to some sort of fetus and pretends to be a man. That, I'm afraid, will not wash in terms of the purity of the idea that he has to be descended from David. You can't be older than David. You cannot be older than your own ancestor. That makes no sense at all. It would be excellent for everybody to read J.A.T. Robinson's The Priority of John. The section on Christology is unmatched. It's really very good on the subject that we're discussing. And then James Dunn's Christology in the Making is very, very important, because pre-existence undermines the human Jesus. That's the danger against which John warned in 1 John 4, where John says, test the spirits. Those who believe Jesus as the one coming en sarki, within the sphere of human being, are doing well. But those who do not believe in that Jesus as an anaphoric article, they're most important. There's a question there in 1 John 4:1 about which Jesus are you espousing? Either the one who came en sarki, was fully human, the one described so beautifully by Matthew, Mark and Luke, particularly Matthew and Luke. But if you venture into the dangerous territory of a pre-existing, essentially non-human, pre-human Jesus, you're mixing Christ with Antichrist on that Johannine test. You don't need that. You don't need to antedate the begetting of Jesus. Read him back into the Old Testament, at worst creating two gods and defying the monotheism of Jesus, and also the great danger of making him an angel. He certainly was not Michael the angel. Michael the archangel is said to be one of the chief angels in Daniel 10:13. Jesus is not one of any category. He's unique. And he's uniquely begotten, brought into existence, because that word yenao in Greek means to cause, to come into existence. A very clear word, has a sharp edge on it. The whole of Christology fell apart once Origen started talking about the eternal generating of the sun. That's just a fog word. You can't have an eternal generation. Generate means to bring into existence in time. And it's that point that Luke and Matthew are laboring with all the effort that they can muster in their wonderful birth narratives. Oh, and you should read, of course, Raymond Brown's birth narratives, unparalleled description and unequaled, really, in power, insisting that Matthew and Luke do not believe in a pre-existing Jesus, nor then should you.